Chapter 20. Would you relax, please? Sabine scolded, another servicing tray bounding off the room's floor with an obnoxious clatter. Hera bore her eyes into the Mandalorian's with severity. If you tell me to relax one more time, Sabine, I swear. Hera began her threat but peeled out of it as the ongoing labor pains racked her pelvis, turning her threat into a shout of torment. Gah! Sabine could only swallow hard and tune out the vocalized anguish as she snatched at Hera's flailing hand, trying vainly to provide comfort. She watched helplessly as the Twi'lek's cheeks converged from the soft dulcet green to a rosy pink, beads of sweat lining her brow. Hera's hand was firmly in her grip, and she could sense the pain subsiding for the time being as the muscles began to relax in her hand and arm. She could only watch Hera pump her lungs, her chest rising and falling quickly to replenish their air. Hera finally closed her eyes as she tilted her head onto the pillow, her body calming and finding a relaxing peace. Sabine whirled at a knock at the door. "Carapast!" she swore, gently plying her hand loose of Hera's and firing over to silence the interloper, almost tripping over the pile she made of her armor on the floor. Stumbling to regain her balance, she slammed her hand into the door actuator, not caring who was on the other side. As she burst through and kicked the opposing actuator to close it. "Zeb, she's resting!" "Not to put too fine a point on it, but you're making more noise than I am. A lot more," Garel Zeb Aurelios pointed out with a hand on the back of his head, massaging the thump he received from Sabine's less than warm greeting. "Get off," he finished, pushing her off his chest and onto the floor. "She's driving me crazy," Sabine said in a shouted whisper as she picked herself up. "I'm gonna pull my hair out," she finished with a gargled exhale. Zeb understood her completely. "It's got to be close. She's worse than a rampaging Wookiee." "CZ said it could be any time now," Sabine added with a hand to her forehead, rubbing out her own thumb from the Lasat's chin. "What was it anyway?" Zeb stared at her with a confused expression, then screwed his face into excitement. "I had an idea. Remember the gas refinery in the Barrow system?" Now it was Sabine's turn to wear the confused expression. "No." "The refinery, mining guild, where we liberated the Klauzon 36 a few years back." "Why wouldn't you start with that?" "Yes, I remember," she answered, a puzzled look continuing to span her features. "Look, we've been cooped up here for the most part, waiting for the Empire to retaliate," Zeb continued with unabashed exhilaration, as his mind spewed words faster than his mouth could utter. "Zeb, what is the point?" "The Purrgil, Sabine, remember? What if we were able to shut down more of those refineries?" Zeb said a little more slowly, so as not to confuse the subject. The dawning realization slammed her right in the face as she raised a hand to punctuate her understanding. "Zeb, that's brilliant," she said, forgetting about her forehead. "Why didn't we think of that before?" "Well, it is a long shot, but it's something," he responded with his palms raised and crooked smile. "I thought that maybe that might cheer her up," he said after a few moments with a thumb arced toward the medbay doorway. Sabine nodded in the affirmative as she closed the distance back toward the door. She was about to punch the actuator when she heard a slight whimper from the other side. Pressing her ear to the panel, she could hear Hera swabbing. Sabine drooped her head in response and felt longingly against the door as her hand slid from its cupped position. She turned slowly to face Zeb, his expression one of deep concern as he swallowed hard and hugged her. "Come on, let's go talk to her," he said, the deepness of his voice reaching sentimental crackles. He gently pushed the actuator, the door hissing open quietly as they focused on Hera's huddled form, her arms folded over her knees. "I wish you were here, Kanan," they both heard her say into her lap. Sabine looked to Zeb, hoping he could provide a reprieve from the threat of her tears, but he found that he had one of his own, tracing down his cheek. Zeb placed his arm around her shoulder and pulled her close as they approached Hera. "We're here for you, Hera," Sabine said as she placed her hand on Hera's shoulder, Zeb taking the other. "We wish he were here too, Hera," Zeb said, gently squeezing the shoulder. Hera did her best to compose herself, a bluster of arms and hands trying to wipe away her tears. "I know," she choked through a sob. "I know, and thank you, both." She blew out her exhausting breath as she stared at the foot of the bed before her. I just miss him. They both gently squeezed her shoulders. Hera, Sabine started, figuring there was no time like the present. Zeb has an idea. Go again for Audi, Audenhoen said with a hand clap to the side of his head. He briefly eased his foot off the accelerator to diminish his bike's whining repulsors. I say again, Deputy Director, I am having the remainder of the graves exhumed. Ship's manifest out of Bodajef placed the interim scale crew of the Tangible at 12, Side said with a mild static charge of electronic warble. There were 13 graves, Audenhoen thought to himself as he and Areti were a stone's throw from the remains of the settlement. He swiveled a motion to Areti, tapping the side of his head. Giving him an affirmative nod, he knew she had heard as well. They both eased back on their respective accelerators as they pulled up to Silas, waving his arms over his head. If I may, Audi, although it is not a requirement by any means, I did request you to activate your body cam to benefit all involved. Side chimed in through the earbud beat again. Audenhoen mumbled a curse under his breath as he smacked the device he had attached to his chest, again turning to Areti to see her shaking her head. Apologies, Captain. I thought I had it activated, Audenhoen lied. Thank you, Audi. Please keep me apprised of the team's findings at site. We are currently at the settlement, Audi said, as his bike pulled to a stop right before the helmetless trooper, Areti's a few seconds later. Copy, will do, side out. Audenhoen hadn't taken his eyes off Areti, tapping his right index finger and thumb together several times, then following with a closed fist. She nodded with a subtle chin drop. No audio was not being relayed off-planet. Silas, Audenhoen said to the trooper as he turned toward him, have you found anything else of interest? More of the same, sir. Deliberate clues left to obfuscate, Silas responded. Areti turned her attention to the datapad again, silently hoping for another sign from whoever was trying to get her attention. She listened to the exchange between Audenhoen and Silas with passive interest, scanning the smoldering village with a keen eye. How did they know we were coming, she asked herself, wondering how they could stage this incursion so quickly. Look here, sir, she heard Silas say, her attention in the conversation renewed. These scorch marks register a high level of glautrium residues, Silas said, pointing to charred marks around a doorframe of the closest dwelling. Why is that noteworthy? Areti asked herself. Glautrium? Audenhoen strode to the doorway, running a fingertip over the blackened surface. I've never heard of it. Silas straightened himself into a formal stance. Apologies, sir, I did not mean to offend. Audenhoen raised a dismissive hand as he glared at the scorched metal and brick. No offense whatsoever, Silas. It is a testament to your knowledge. Areti was a blaze of movement on her datapad, finding only several entries for the alloy. Scarce, hardening properties at the high end are 20 times the density of durasteel, with a quarter of the weight. However, it does not appear in enough quantities to be considered harvestable, so the Empire does not consider mining it worthy of time. These scorch marks are not Imperial, she advised the two, knowing full well her assessment would surprise neither. Then who the hell did? Sorry, sir, Silas asked. We have anything on suspected trajectories? Audenhoen asked in return. Silas tapped his wrist comm. 7. Any contact points yet? Mark 34.7, Mark 33.9, Mark 72.8, Mark 57.9, Mark 44.812. Silas relayed the audio feed from his earbead. That last one was damn accurate, Audenhoen responded, looking to Areti. She entered a trajectory referencing their present location. Ambria is on a direct path unless it's just a stopping point, she informed them, her eyes still glued to the datapad screen. There is nothing on Ambria, she stated, looking up at the men. It is by all rights a dead planet. Audenhoen couldn't stifle his laugh. If life has taught me anything, it's that nothing is as it seems, Areti. Neither Silas nor Areti could argue the point. Sir, I will rendezvous with Team 2 and collab our findings, Silas said with attempted formal grace. Very good, Silas. Thank you for your assistance, Audenhoen said. I don't believe we're going to find anything else of note, personally. Areti watched with Audenhoen as the trooper turned on his heel and walked up the central road, disappearing into the thick black smoke of the dying fires. Ambria? She said, turning to Audenhoen. I've never even heard of it. Audenhoen mumbled his agreement, returning to the scorch marks on the doorway. Areti, why is this important? He asked her, extending his finger toward the blackened surface. Well, as stated earlier, the Empire does not use glautrium due to its rarity, and most certainly not in the fire control of a TIE fighter. To answer your question, it was deliberately done separate from the rest of what is most certainly a stage scene, Areti said after a few long moments of contemplation. Good start, but you're pointing out the obvious, Audenhoen responded with a sly smirk, his left hand stroking the stubble at his cheeks. My question then takes the form of observation. Why take the time to scorch an area or areas, he amended with a glance towards similar buildings, when they intend on decimating the area anyway? Areti wasn't sure the last was a question, having worked with the man long enough to pick up on his audible nuances. Hid something, she offered. Audenhoen swung his gaze to her fully. Now that is precisely the answer I was looking for. Do we have our particle scanner? Side watched the small video feed display featuring the odd angle of Audenhoen's body cam footage. He ran his long, slender fingers through his groomed hair sweepingly, trying to decipher what was on this building that drew the deputy director's undivided attention. His interest increased when his assistant proffered a scanning device from her pack and handed it to the man. Prit, give me this feed on 2. 7. Analyze, Side said, walking with care toward the leftmost screen in the rear of his command deck. Resting his hand upon the final bank of computers before the screen, he squinted his eyes as the live feed transferred from the tiny screen of the databank rose to the giant screen. His interest lay within the readings of the scanner as it resolved to display a set of symbols. The deputy director has instructed his particle scanner to negate readings of glautrium deposit and the heavy residue of carbon scoring, 7 added as script became visible around the entirety of the symbol. Side's interest lie beyond the methods employed. 7. Identify. I cannot, sir. The scrawl is of no known origin, and there is no graphic entries similar to the symbol itself. Code, sir? Purrgil offered beside him. Possibly. That would explain the need to eradicate its presence thoroughly, Side commented with his hand cupping his chin. To what end, he thought to himself. Sir, sorry, but Team 3 has completed the evacuation. Feed on 3. A junior officer, Ensign Lett, added from his position to Side's extreme right. Side's attention swiveled to the screen on the right as the garish scene snapped into view. The grave occupant was garbed in stained white armor, the black undersuit flayed and shredded, allowing all to see the words carved into the figure's torso. Tovik? He heard Bev ask behind him. TC-245, assigned garrison duty to Trunnion Moon, outpost in the Bodajev sector. Sir, this trooper was not assigned with the other officers at the gravesite, 7 said for all to hear. What's wrong with his head? Purrgil asked, Side's attention drawn to the odd cant of the deceased man's chin, how it lay far too low upon his upper chest. Arlen, lift the chin, Side commanded his trooper on the scene. Various gasps of shock and alarm sounded throughout the command deck as the mutilation of the man's neck was displayed for all. How could they do this? Side heard someone ask. He peeled his gaze from the screen to address his crew. First, we deal in fact. This command deck will not operate under conjecture. He said it without focusing on the source of the question directly. Secondly, insurgents or not, whoever took the time to inter our dead could not be responsible for a grievous wound such as that. He finished with a flourish, his hand extended toward the gruesome scene. Operate within the field of sanity and common sense. He did that to himself, Purrgil voiced Side's point. Excellent, Prit. Let's put the puzzle together. If I may, sir, Bev addressed the command deck. The insurgents were reportedly on the ground, attempting to slice into the Imperial network within the garrison itself on the Trunnion Moon. Protocol and directive drove Admiral Kane to dispatch the LC Tangible to contain the breach. 12 is not a crew, not even a Skell crew, sir, Ensign Lett added. More importantly, if they are all accounted for, how is the ship itself recorded as destroyed? Pritt voiced his thoughts. Kane's directive is quite clear in his focus, and as a result, he does not have the luxury of full crew complements. I would wager he sent what he could to answer your inquiry, Lett, Side offered. That is an excellent point, Pritt. He swung to the man, his finger outstretched toward him. Follow that thought to conclusion. The ship is now in the hands of the rebels, Pritt answered immediately, topping his head with the palms of his hands, with a new signature entirely. Side's face widened in a knowing smile as the sum of conclusion was nearing its apex. We know someone quite talented in that particular art, do we not? Farty. Bev blew out the name louder than anticipated. Side turned to her with a wink. Farty. What am I looking at? Audenhoen asked Areti after the scanner had reported its findings. I have no idea. If the script is a language, it's one I've never seen before, Areti responded, her head at his shoulder, looking deeply into the scanner's display. This symbol, she said with a finger directly atop the screen, could be nothing more than scribbles for what it infers. Audenhoen noted the simplicity of the statement and appreciated the subjective removal of easy from their collective vocabulary, as he knew she didn't believe in that in any case any more than he did. Fire up that data pad already. Let's see what we can find out. Audie. Side's voice crackled over his earbead. Go for Audie. We are currently looking into the symbol and text from your image, but I also wanted you to be aware of our findings at the gravesite, Side said rapidly, Audenhoen doing his best to keep up. The 13th grave was a stormtrooper, TC-245, assigned to Trunnion Moon Garrison in Kane's Sector Command. He suffered a mortal self-inflicted wounds, a spade, we believe. Audenhoen lowered the scanner in his hands, pulling his eyes together in thought. A spade? He was assisting with the internment? He let the question flow. Assisting or merely present, we may never know, Side responded. But we've pieced together what we believe is of more importance, he continued with a modulated warble. The tangible crew, as you had deduced, were also felled from friendly fire. Our insurgents are then only responsible for the theft of Imperial property and nothing more. Theft? Audenhoen, far from confused, having witnessed the transgression in real time, wasn't willing to author any form of narrative Side could sway. The tangible itself, we believe, was their intended target, Side answered. Who could pull off slicing on that level? Audenhoen almost berated himself for his lack of decorum as he asked the questions before thinking them through. We may have that answer as well, Deputy Director. Areti could feel the datapad in her hand noticeably vibrate, catching her attention enough to drop her gaze. Having the wherewithal to step away from Audenhoen and his cam, she swung her body to the right and out of view entirely before grasping the item with her other hand to give it her undivided attention. The display shifted slightly from the formatted search she had tasked it with before dissolving entirely to a black screen. What the... Her thought trailed off as a simple line of text appeared in blue. Garel. The data entry cursor jumped to the line below the location and blinked several times. Come alone. Areti contained the gasp that would have alerted her superior. Her mind racing as her heart began hammering in her chest. How was anyone doing this, she asked herself. She had configured the device well beyond secure ISB protocols herself. She continued staring into the screen as its resolution snapped sharply to the left and restored its original contents just as she heard Audenhoen's footfalls behind her. What is it, Areti? Audenhoen asked with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Just interference, I think, she stammered, catching his attention with a sidelong glance as he emerged into her peripheral view. She noticed the look in his eyes, a flood of shame washing over her. I don't trust those who keep things from us, Audie. She regained her composure, saying, We are ISB after all, are we not? Audenhoen exhaled deeply, his eyes losing the accusatory look Areti had noticed and adopting one of concern. There will be times when we specifically will not know what side we are on, either through our own endeavors or through the actions of others. The intelligence community is generally one of suspicions, half-truths, full lies, or misdirection, sometimes all of the above, he said with passion in his voice. But we must follow our intuition wherever it takes us to find truth, he said slowly, gazing down the main thoroughfare the settlement offered. There will be times when even that supersedes what is best for the Empire. Areti almost dropped the datapad onto the debris-strewn ground, looking directly at the man's profile. She could sense the honesty in his words, but beyond that, she knew he was right. Not even our Empire is above truth, Audenhoen said, Raada's sun beaming off his glistening head. That is our job, Areti. Find truth, he finalized, returning to look directly at her. She was sure he hadn't seen the datapad, so she could only surmise that he knew something of what was turning her insides to such a degree. However, his words had assured her that she would be responsible for her initiatives and that he would allow her that freedom. Nadali was certain giving the Shalactin her location was not a clever idea, but this particular exchange needed conclusion. She just took an enormous gamble, but had enough sense to do so in a system under direct Imperial oversight. A lone Gazanti freighter wouldn't even register across their system-wide operations. However, she knew she had to remain cautious, as that same strategy could backfire with horrendous consequence. What else does one say? She stewed over the question for several moments, deciding on recurrence. Come alone, she prompted her voiceover algorithm subconsciously. Well, she thought, your move, Areti. She found the thought humorous, despite her lack of emotional base. Ironic seemed a better fit, she thought, considering she was utilizing Tagatataya's link to Side's network, one she knew the captain would discover sooner rather than later. Sir, we have detected a foreign intrusion into our network, Seven said distinctly and softly into Evanside's earbeat. He continued staring at the center screen of the Sidious's command deck, watching as the teams on the ground packed up their equipment. His expression unchanging, he brought up a hand to cup over his mouth. Location, he whispered into his palm. It is minute, too subtle to be traced, nor would it even be recognized by a crew member in our estimation. Location, unknown, Seven replied. Continue tracing, find that intrusion. Working, sir. Bev, get me Hung, Side said, dropping his hand. Ready, she responded. Hung, get your teams back up while we determine the next action. I want everyone off the ground in 5 minutes. Copy, sir, Hung responded in his heavy Mikapan accent. Side looked at his screens briefly before spinning on his heel to walk from the command deck. He punched the actuator in his quarters and sat down at his work desk, pulling a small hollow emitter into its center. He connected it to his hollow relay. He waited, tapping his fingertips against the surface of the work desk to occupy himself after pulling on his uniform jacket and buttoning it to regulation. Several long minutes passed before the device whirred with connectivity, and the emitter came to life with a chirp and whirl. Captain. My lord, Side began, the closest lead is a plasma wake anomaly with a possible Ambrian terminus. Shall we meet Lord Vader's fleet there? The flickering image stood motionless, reserved, and silent for another long moment. That would ensure the success of our endeavors, Captain. Sidious responded from the depths of the hood pulled low over his deformed features, his voice reflecting the depths of his thoughts. My concern is the concentrated activity too near Bodijev for my liking, he said, surprising Side. I could easily dispatch contingents of Silent Fleet to reinforce the system while we operate in and around Ambria, Side advised. While also fortifying Ilum? Sidious asked with what sounded like curiosity. Yes, Side was straightforward. If it can be done, then do so, Captain. But not at the cost of Ilum. That is your priority. Understood, my lord. Side snapped the pleasantry. Hesitation staggered his breath momentarily. There is more, Captain. Out with it, then. Other matters require my attention. The tone in Sidious's voice became sharp suddenly. Ambria, who is to have command? Do you have your sights set on such aspirations, Captain? Sidious oozed the words into the air. Aspirations, no, Side said without reservation. Continuity, yes. Sidious seemed to understand the question, given his captain's response. Command of the task force will be given to Lord Vader. His direction will supersede all other directives. Understood, my lord, Side said with a short bow before the emitter, its whirring display closing on itself as the connection severed. Evan Side sat in his chair staring at the emitter longer than he wanted to, thoughts, fleeting at best, flaring through his mind with increasing intensity. His Emperor displayed unusual levels of concern over what was, in Side's opinion, trivial matters. Aspirations for what? Control? Surely Sidious must know he didn't care about control. Something has disturbed or unsettled his Emperor to unusual levels. Side shook the thoughts from his head as he pushed himself from the workspace, stood up, pulled the buttons loose from his jacket and tossed it onto his bunk. Tugging his shirt straight around his waist, he returned to the command deck. Audenhoen knew the order had come down from Side to pack up operations on the ground as the bustle of activity reached a more excited crescendo. Areti nodded. Confirmation of such played to the chirp in his ear. Audi, we have orders to depart for Ambria soonest. Will you be joining Tagadataya as you suggested? Side asked as Audenhoen's initial Lambda-class shuttle approached his position, its humming repulsors drowning his thoughts momentarily. Affirmative, Evan. Do you need us to bring anything back with us? Audenhoen asked, looking toward the crates of scanning equipment, maglevs sporting investigative findings, and several 7-4Zs. Negative. Their shuttles are already inbound, Side said on cue as the entourage of shuttles flew overhead, stirring up the dust and loose dirt at Audenhoen's feet. Copy, he said in response, deactivating the audio hardware altogether. He turned partially to face Areti. They are in one hell of a hurry. She nodded and turned her gaze toward their shuttle, the ramp hissing its way down to the ground. Her stomach tensed as she looked at the dark transparent steel canopy of the shuttle's cockpit. How many were in there, she asked herself, feeling his grip on her shoulder. Let's go already, Audenhoen said, pushing her gently forward. They sat precisely as before, strapping themselves in as the ramp hissed itself shut with a sharp, high-pitched tone. She felt the shuttle lift from the ground, her stomach left behind for all its betrayal now. Without a forward view, she could only estimate the time and distance to the Acclimator-class Star Destroyer that hadn't moved from its position in low orbit. Minutes, she asked herself, feeling the palms of her hands damp with sweat. She rubbed them on the legs of her pants as Audenhoen fired a hand out to grab one of them. She looked into his eyes as he brought a finger to his mouth in a silencing fashion before throwing his other arm over her and pulling her close in an embrace. Her mind reeled. She admittedly had feelings for the man, but felt every one inappropriate given their circumstances. Moreover, she was about to step way outside of her comfort zone to find her truth, and his timing was horrid. With her body close, he crossed his left hand over his abdomen and retrieved the small holdout blaster at his waist, placing it firmly in Areti's lap. He pushed his head close to her ear. It's already set to stun, he whispered, barely audible. It has to be convincing. How the hell did he know? She almost said aloud, stopping herself before some sense of her surroundings forced the words back. She could hear the whine of the Lambda's repulsors take over momentum from the ion drive as she planted her hand around the blaster's grip and pulled back from the embrace with a look of disdain betraying her. He only smiled briefly and nodded before unfastening his harness and grabbing their pack. His expression turned dour as he reached an open palm toward her. She looked into his eyes, not understanding what it was he wanted. With a nod toward the datapad clipped to her waist, he snapped his fingers in a brief cadence of bent knuckles and a quick wrist bend. The datapad must stay? She questioned through her own finger taps and thumb strikes. Absolutely, Audenhoen didn't bother with hand gestures. She gave him a nod and wordlessly handed the device over to him as the shuttle lurched to a stop. the recoil of the landing pads pushing the ship back into place. Now or never, she told herself as the ramp lowered, a sole pilot emerging down the stairs from the cockpit. He nodded toward her as he waited for the two at the ramp access hatch. "I'll be a second, go ahead," Areti told the pilot. "Procedure, ma'am," he said in return. Areti froze in place before her brain could finally get the disagreeing muscles to cooperate. She lifted the blaster and fired a stun salvo directly into the pilot's stomach, the man pitching over immediately. She didn't hesitate as she leveled the blaster at Audenhoen's chest, knowing suspicion would arise with any more hesitation. He nodded as she fired a second salvo into her superior, crumpling the man with the same effect. Hurriedly, she cast the blaster toward the seats as her momentum took her toward the two men. With an audible effort, she rolled them both unceremoniously down the ramp and looked up, noting that all the ground deployments were decanting into this hangar. Realizing she only had seconds, she made sure the two unconscious men were clear of the ramp before scurrying back up and slamming the door actuator. She was halfway up the cockpit stairs when she heard the ramp close with its pinging whinny and felt the shuttle rise from its position off the hangar deck. What the hell? Confusion threatened to relieve her of the remainder of her senses as she burst through the cockpit hatchway to find no one at the controls. A glance out of the canopy alerted her that the ship was retreating back through the hangar bay's magnetic shielding and into the high Raadan atmosphere. The warning klaxon from the Tagada rumbled through the shuttle's framework as she thrust her body into the acceleration seat and buckled the harness around her. "Power down your ion drives and return to the hangar immediately, Miss Sigourney, or you will be fired upon." The onboard comm crackled a threat. Areti scanned the control board and slapped the transceiver. "You misunderstand. I have no control of the ship. Release me at once." She returned her threat, adopting a sinister voice she hadn't known she possessed. The whir of the hyperdrive powering up thrust her senses into panic. "You will be held in contempt." The return threat crackled into non-existence as the shuttle's hyperdrive engaged, elongating the brilliant star at the system center briefly before snapping the ship into the whirling blue light of hyperspace.